it's worth talking about some of the other maybe more qualitative factors that go into evaluating a new STR market. And then maybe down the line, we can talk a little bit about some of the logistics involved with entering a new market. I think largely borne out by some of the successes and failures we've had in other markets that we've operated in. So I think I would say maybe the first thing that I would look to when looking at a new market is what the regulatory landscape looks like. This is something we've talked about at length. We've done a fairly recent episode about regulations and short-term rentals. But I think generally speaking, it's helpful to understand, certainly at a state level, at a county level, but probably most importantly at the municipality level, what do short-term regulations look like in the area where you're looking? Sometimes this can be tough because if you're looking at a new market, you may not know exactly what town you want to be in, but you might know you want to be in a general region that could consist of 5 or 10 or 40 different towns. And in that context, you're going to have to probably wait until you hone in on an actual property and then evaluate what the regulations look like in that municipality itself.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrating things that we found, and I think still is the case, and we touched on this in a prior episode about it, is the lack of regulation in a lot of these places. So I think if you consider it as a spectrum, right, there are places where it is doing short-term rentals is just completely impermissible.
And nowadays, to the extent that STR regulations exist, it seems like they are most prevalent in places that have either a lot of tourism demand and so stands to reason that it's just much more relevant, or larger cities where there's just so much housing activity and there's enough volume, even if it's a relatively small subset of the housing stock. That it's
I would say that to the extent that there are regulations, probably most regulations are those that are restricting or limiting the usage, the ability to do STRs. I think there are fewer municipalities in general, or just jurisdictions that have legislation that is there to kind of promote STRs, perhaps except for very, very touristy areas where their whole economy is driven by tourism. But even then, there's sometimes some pushback from, maybe existing hotel players or other hospitality providers. But, so that's the spectrum of that. The opposite end of it, or the completely other side of it, is that you get places where there is no regulation at all, which could mean that STRs are permitted by lack of them being prohibited, or it could mean that the city could interpret other regulations on their books as prohibiting STRs, like full stop. For example, we've seen places where it's required to get a new certificate of occupancy before every occupant, regardless if that occupant is there for a week or a day or a year. And that kind of can function as a prohibition on doing short-term rentals, because you're not going to get a new CO before a person checks in for the weekend or whatever. Other times, cities will interpret zoning laws to say, oh well, if your use is kind of a hotel use, that's not permitted in the zoning, which says residential. And of course, there's ambiguity about what that is. We've talked about this already, but I think going to research these things, that itself is a challenge, because if you wanted to find out I'm interested in doing an STR in this place in upstate New York, can I do it in upstate New York? I would say probably 60% of the time. So New York might be a weird example because they have overarching laws, but let's say New Jersey, maybe 70% of the time there's nothing. You won't find a single news report, press release, whatever. If you go into the ordinances, you won't find a single thing. And then the other 30% of the time, you can actually find something relevant, good or bad.
And it's probably not to your benefit to call up City Hall and ask them these questions, because I think in a lot of people's minds, the last thing they want to do is put these things on those people's radar.
Yeah.
Maybe those people isn't the right thing to say.
The elected officials. Are doing a great job. So I think that's like a gating question. So if you go to a municipality or a place and you can't do STRs there, in my book, the inquiry ends. If you go to a municipality where you can do STRs there, like it says in the law that it's permitted, you can keep going on the path. If there's a municipality or whatever that there's no regulation on it, I think might be worthy of further thought. but I would go in with caution because it's easily conceivable that the city could say, no, we don't want that, and then ban them later on after you've bought, a portfolio of STRs, whatever you want to do. So that's, I guess a flip side of it too is that, Ryan, we've been talking a little bit about the future of STRs. I know there's some people in the STR community that talk about this. The line between an STR and sort of a boutique hotel, I think, is a little bit blurry. And I don't mean that in, practical usage. I mean that more so in a land use perspective. So, it's not inconceivable for me to think about going to a municipality where the short-term rental usage of a house or an apartment is not permitted. However, it is possible to buy or construct or retrofit or whatever a property to be a hotel and obtain that zoning, the ability to do that because it's permitted via zoning as a right in the zone where that asset is located. So that's kind of another wrinkle to it, I suppose.
Yeah, we've I mean, I don't want to get too into the weeds on regulation, but it's interesting to think about sort of like maybe the future of this in some respects is not necessarily redefining short-term rentals or creating a new classification of that, but maybe it's more so about reimagining what it is to be a hotel or what it is to be a motel, and maybe the definitions that municipalities will use to govern those will change a little bit so that something that looks like a single-family home or a two-family home could maybe more easily be classified as a hotel or motel,
right,
and then be subject to governance accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the awkwardness of the regulatory scene right now. But yeah, in any case, I would say that's an important gating step that you brought up, Ryan.
Don't forget to visit us at brickxbrickrealestate.com for free content to help you along your real estate journey and to follow along on our projects. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app and engage with us online via Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and brickxbrickrealestate.com. See you next time on the Brick by Brick podcast.